Come as everybody's getting ready for the chili and going downstairs and coming up, and good thing we got a pew to sit in and rest the whole time, recover. Yeah. So good. Well, okay, as we continue on, as we recall, we're looking at the changes that took place that were leading up to the 1960s, certainly a period of tremendous change. And we've seen that these influences of the anti-communism, because what was going on in the world and the influence, and then also we saw the anti-Catholic rhetoric that was very prominent among Protestant groups, and a lot of that had to do with they were fearful that the Pope would take over everything, would control things. And so, the idea of freedom and so on and so forth. And so there were those that kind of lumped them together. And so in this period, we see this assimilation with this putting together of the American view, culture, if you will, and the fellowship of the kingdom of God, and how much that so totally changed from the 19th century views that were going on. And so that's where we're at. And so, as we recall, The Voice of Freedom was a publication that was made by G.C. Brewer and some others, and that was kind of an influential publication in our fellowship, and that's where we're at. The five men who, along with Brewer, provided fellowship for The Voice of Freedom included B.C. Goodpasture, editor of the Gospel Advocate, and Batsell Barrett Baxter, professor at Lipscomb. And by 1960, the National Herald of Truth television program. The Voice of Freedom was no off-the-wall venture representing a mere fringe in the fellowship. It enjoyed full support of the Nashville establishment, and a point that speaks loudly of the theological transitions that took place in our fellowship since World War I. Further, none of these leaders who promoted anti-communist or anti-Catholic sentiment among churches of Christ seemed to sense these campaigns represented any significant departure from our historic, non-denominational, and primitive identity. To the contrary, they believed that these cultural and political campaigns grew quite naturally out of the vision of primitive Christianity. And this was illustrated by Henry Bowden, and he's a historian, whose contention that primitivists, peering into the well of history and seeking to discern there the outlines of the ancient faith, wind up seeing only a reflection of their own concerns. Now, what does that mean? What do you think that means? It's kind of the idea that, looking back into history to find things to promote or justify what we think now. And so you can find that. Now, what is that called when you're studying Scripture? There's a word for it. It's all... and I just said that, and I forgot it too, so I'm influenced by everybody else. It's going to come to me. Where you're basically looking to find what you want to support your position, rather than looking to see what it says and letting that influence. Exegesis is when you look to see what the Scripture says to influence you, and the other one was what? Eisegesis. Is that it? Okay. Those big terms. Yeah, so in the but of course. Well, college guy, college professor. So, to the contrary, they believe that these cultural and political, as we said, campaigns grew naturally out of these things. And so, I think one of the things that we've been trying to point out this whole time in our class is to get us to see that we all view things through lenses. and that we've got to be aware that we don't construe things we understand based on influences of other things when we say, oh, this is just a pure and uninfluenced view of things, because we're all influenced by things. This was particularly true of Brewer and the Voice of Freedom. If the Bible provided principal support for American civilization, then a defense of America seemed necessary to defend the Bible itself. So we see how that thinking comes together, or at least in its principles. Likewise, to expose Catholicism was to expose the corruptions that had befallen the primitive church. And of course, we're all familiar with that. We look at the New Testament church in the first couple hundred years, and then Rome got a hold of it, and all the problems that came with that. And then you had the Protestant Reformation about 1,200 years after that, and so on and so forth. Brewer and his colleagues thus sacralized the voice for freedom. Now, what is that? That's a medical term where you're basically fusing your vertebrae. So so this idea, this bringing together these two different things and almost equating them as one. And at the same time, sacralize the America they sought to defend with the mythology, if you will, the primitive church and biblical Christianity. On the masthead of the very first issue of The Voice of Freedom appeared the slogan, an undenominational, non-sectarian publication devoted to telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and about the threat of our freedom from Catholicism and communism. And so that was the subheading on the title. And so, and they believed that deeply. That made total sense to them, and that understanding, and that as seeing those two as being related. Mainstream churches of Christ thus approached the decade of the 1960s as defenders of American civilization as they conceived it, especially through the lens of Southern culture. This was a cause, they imagined, altogether compatible with the historic commitment to primitive Christianity. Accordingly, these churches no longer stood separate and apart from their culture, hurling apocalyptic judgment on the kingdom of the world. Instead, they viewed America as the kingdom of God, and they sought to defend the kingdom. And so, from what there was in the beginning of so many, had by this time so completely changed for the mass and how that viewed. Now, that's not saying that I'm not up here to tell you that's right or that's wrong. I'm just telling you that was this change that took place. And most of us, if not all of us, are very familiar with this, equating to this. In the times that we grew up and so on, this was very, very prominent, and not just within our fellowship. That was kind of across the board. And so Ken's basically saying that how much of this really affected the rank and file, if you want to call it that. Well, probably like anything else we've said and we've talked about, you pointed out, well, we didn't even know what that was, or whatever it was, whereas others, that was the hot topic. And so I assume, or I would speculate, that basically like anything, there's this spectrum. And some people are much more, and some people are lesser, and some people may not be at all, affected. Yet, these are things that are it's kind of like with political parties. Not everybody necessarily agrees with the whole platform or whatever they're suing, yet they still, for whatever reasoning, there's enough of there that they vote that way, and of course the opposite. And I suspect this is probably something like that. Yet these things were influential. Now, just like the media was very influential, and now we hear talk about how they're called the legacy media or whatever, the older stuff, that how uninfluential that apparently is, or at least from what it once was. And so, but I would say in this time there's probably a lot of influence, but it depends on the degree. Some people are not near as passionate or think things are near as important as sometimes other people do. So that would be my answer, because these things did influence things, and we're going to see that as we go along. Because remember, things, what do they talk about, the butterfly effect? Have you heard of that? The idea the butterfly way over here flaps its wings and turns into a monsoon over there. Now, whether that's scientifically valid or not, I don't know. But the point is that it starts little and can get more influential. Yes, Gerald.
Maybe some of that influence still present today. Our Constitution says that there will not be a state religion. However, people who are Christian generally believe that abortion is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That is a Christian principle.
Yeah.
And so if we demand that of everybody else, then we're saying our religion is better than their religion or better than no religion.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little bit of that still present today.
Well, sure. And as we're going to go look on as we get into the 60s, we're going to see that there was those that greatly said, wait a minute, that's how we make change. And they bought into all the political influence and so on and so forth. And we're going to talk about that as we go. So, yeah, and that's, I'm not saying that's right or that's wrong. It's just that people come down in different places on that. Having adopted such a posture, Churches of Christ were singularly unprepared for the ethical changes of the events of the 60s presented to America. During that decade, many, if not most, among our fellowship sided time and time again with what we would call the status quo against the forces of social change that were exploding in American culture. And that was a time of great upheaval, no matter how someone viewed it. It was a time of great upheaval and change. And so how do we fit in? And so as Joe pointed out, as we were talking about Kennedy last week, within our fellowship generally, and others, was this tradition of anti-Catholicism extended that had been there from the beginning, if you will, because as we've already chronicled, communism reached back over a quarter century, and most of our fellowship staunchly opposed the election of John Kennedy to the presidency of the United States. Not that they thought he was a communist. Later, most members of our mainstream churches strongly supported the Vietnam War, which they viewed as a war against communist aggression. So there was many things going on in the 60s. There was the stuff about the war, there was the civil rights, there was this, and so much turbulence. Most of the members and leaders in the Church of Christ in virtually every segment of our tradition, from Foy Wallace to the Christian Chronicle to the Gospel Guardian, the Gospel Advocate, and the Firm Foundation, even the 20th Century Christian, opposed the election of John Kennedy. They feared the prospect of America being governed by a Catholic president because they imagined such a president would be subservient to Rome, which in effect the United States would end up being governed by the Pope. And so they mobilized a massive crusade in the Merida publications to warn their own members and Americans at large of the grave dangers to the United States that would be posed by a Kennedy presidency. And so the idea of he's Catholic, so he'll be controlled by the Pope, so we don't want him, is basically the thinking. And many thought that. Obviously not all, because he got elected. Okay, and so just interesting. Of course, we're not alone in publicizing these concerns. The National Association of Evangelicals resolved in April of 1960 to oppose Kennedy's election because of his Catholicism, and Southern Baptists throughout the South announced much the same. While normally shunning relations with Protestant bodies, Churches of Christ worked hand in glove with a variety of Protestant churches and anti-Catholic groups to work out strategies to defend Kennedy. Their newfound denominational status had never been more apparent than it was in this crusade. In other words, traditionally it said, hey, you guys aren't quite right, and yet banding together now to work toward this common cause. This is how Churches of Christ greeted the decade of the 60s. Little did we know that when a decade was through, that we'd have to come to terms with a generally multicultural America, something very different. Carol Ellis, writing in the Gospel Advocate, offered a classic argument that characterized the arguments against Kennedy. The Roman Catholic Church, he suggested, was not just as a religion, but a temporal power that claims a divine sanction. The ideal relationship, therefore, is one in which the civil government will foster the teachings and claims of Catholicism. Kennedy will be morally bound as the Roman Catholic president, warned Ellis, to enforce the will of the Catholic Church in America. So that was their fears on that. Some of this sounds like today, not that topic, but just, the labeling and fears and things. Carl. Wasn't that Goldwater? I think that was a Goldwater. Yeah. Or bringing it back. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 Sure. Sure. Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, so you realize in politics that everybody wants to paint the other person as just so far out there and all these terrible things, and not that there's maybe not some substance to it, but a lot of times it's just, you got to be kidding me. Yeah. So we see the techniques are no different than they have been forever. is basically the point. Editor B.C. Goodpasture intimated that Catholics might even kill those who resisted their control. Those who think no danger to our religious freedom is involved are evidently not acquainted with history. Goodpasture warned they do not know about the fires of Smithfield. I don't know what that is specifically. The horrors of the Spanish Inquisition, most of us have read about some of those. The bloody massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day and the frightful slaughter of the Waldenses and the, I can't even say that, but Albigenses, but that was over in Europe. And I think, was that France, the St. Bartholomew's? And so, and we chronicled back in the 16th, 17th centuries, just battles that went on and how many people were killed that brought on some of the Enlightenment thinking. How do you deal with this? Everybody killing each other over the Bible, as we talked about. But anyhow, so we see this. So he's looking back, say, hey, wait a minute, they've done this before. Who's to say they won't do that again? And yet, I think as you're pointing out, Carl, that there's some other things in place that probably prevent some of that. In one of his editorials, Good Pastor promoted a book entitled Mr. Kennedy, We Challenge You, which invited the candidate to prove that your church does not claim the right to put Protestants, Jews, liberals, and other heretics to death, and that your becoming president would not hasten this happy day. Do you intend to help the church put to death any and all the heretics and evangelicals when der Tag, the day arrives? So they throw in the little German statement. And so you can see how this really plays or tries to manipulate, thoughts and emotions and bringing it out. And so, can you prove? Well, how can he? It's tricky stuff. Rule Lemons, editor of the Firm Foundation, suggested that Catholicism and democracy were simply hostile to one another. One cannot be loyal to both, regardless of how he may try. On the other hand, Rule Lemons asserted that communism and Catholicism were peas in a pod. Structurally, the two were identical. Philosophically, they're identical. Militarily, they're identical. And their aim at world domination is identical. For all three reasons, he strongly resisted the presidency of John Kennedy. And so a number of you all lived, and you're not unfamiliar with some of this. These things that went on in that time, and experienced those. Now, I'm not saying one this or one that, but we just realize these things went on. Uh-oh. Writing for the Firm Foundation, W.A. Holly described in some detail his vision of what a Catholic America might look like. Should the Catholic Church ever gain control of the United States, she would force upon the citizens of our country union of church and state. She would raid our public treasury for funds to promote her sectarian doctrine. She would place her stooges in key positions and thus dominate our domestic and foreign policy. She would censor our media of communication. She would bind upon our children all the backwardness and superstition of our outmoded educational system. She would saddle our doctors, nurses, and hospitals with her medical and unscientific medical practices. Her priests would become masters of marriage, home, and children, and she, through the index of forbidden books, would enslave our minds, telling us what to read and what to think. Now, the forbidden books is, as you know, the Catholic Bible has what's called the Apocrypha in it. In other words, books that the Protestant Bible removed, and that's what that references to. And so we see, wow, just the worst things in the world would happen. Bill. sure. Well, fortunately, these, I don't think these things are as prominent, certainly, or as far flung as, I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying it's not, I don't think it's as widespread as it once was. Now, to give what you're pointing out, listen, Ralph Blake, as you all know, this congregation started in their house up north of town here. Well, this area where we're at here, this was called Church Row, and there was a reason for it, Ralph said. And this was a Catholic town, and nobody else could get a property to start a church here because there was lots of influence. And then some farmer that was over here, I don't know if he was Catholic or not, but decided to sell something, some piece to somebody. And then we were eventually part of some of that also, and that's why he got the Baptist, the Lutheran. The others are all over here because, uptown was that. And he said that was very real. And so, in other words, just acknowledging these things existed and were so. Yes, sir. Yeah. Sure. And there's a lot of people that hold those views that and we look to Deuteronomy and other passages like that says if they're talking about Israel, but then we equate us, America, or other countries. England did it, as we talked about that in the other time. And so and so this idea of if you're not living righteously, these bad things are going to befall you. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, as the one historian we quoted a little earlier, we can all look back and point on, different things. And so, yeah. And so anyhow, so we see this dynamic, this atmosphere, this spirit, and it was very common. It's what it was. And so, I've always tried to preface this and go, let's be hesitant to condemn them because, per se, I'm not saying that we agree with those ideas now, but because we'd have been no different. Because we would be in that same atmosphere, wouldn't realize, wouldn't this and that. And so thankful, I'm thankful we're on this side of some of that.
All we've done is change the subject. We haven't changed the mindset.
I don't think we've changed the mindset at all.
Yeah.
We have a country that's split.
Sure.
Regardless of what happened on Tuesday,
Yeah.
this country is still split.
It's very split.
If you read or watched any of the nonsense on the web or on the television this weekend, it's finger pointing and why we did this,
Sure.
how we did
Sure.
what went wrong. It's their problem, and everybody's all upset.
Well, and when we, but and one of the reasons for looking at this, how uncomfortable this is because these things are still energizing what's going on around us. And so it's important that we at least try to understand some of that thinking because, you look on the TV and you see people pulling out the old race things and all these things and blaming how Trump got elected, and there would be many that would say that had nothing to do with it. But it was other things, and yet some of these things, however rightly or wrongly, they energize it. And so these are things that are developing, and so we see in this atmosphere. Anyhow, no publication among the Churches of Christ spoke more loudly against the presidency of Kennedy than the Voice of Freedom under the editorship of L.R. Wilson of Claiborne, Texas. Even more explicitly than G.C. Brewer, Wilson fused the biblical primitivism of our heritage with historic American ideals. The Constitution was based upon the principles laid down in God's Word, he argued, and he rejoiced that President Eisenhower, who believes in the supreme God, who believes the Bible is God's revelation and praise to the Almighty God. In Wilson's view, the Voice of Freedom was committed only to New Testament Christianity, our American ideals, and the Constitution of the United States. And so he's just kind of laying out his understanding. Wilson charged that the Roman Church had acted as an accomplice to many evils that had befallen the Western world in the 19th and 20th centuries. From the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and I don't understand that connection. I can't explain that, why he said that. But, you know, sometimes people just find all kinds of things. To Hitler's rise to power. Even now, Wilson argued, the Catholic Church in America sought to control the education of our youth, to curtail the freedom of the press, to restrict our individual freedom, and to control the minds of the people. And so again, there's just nothing good that can come from that. Some among our fellowship even found subtle Catholic propaganda in the popular music of the period. One man complained to his local radio station that such songs as The Lady of Fatima, and I can hear it in my head. I'm not going to be like Shane and sing it to you. Village of St. Bernadette and Shrine on the Top of the Hill were subtle means of indoctrination designed to promote the Kennedy candidacy. I, for one, he wrote, cannot let my child be taught through songs of this kind and doctrines not found in my New Testament. In other words, you know, when you're so into this whole mindset of things, you see stuff everywhere, and it may or may not be there. You know, and so, anyhow. Chet Huntley, I remember the Huntley-Brinkley News Hour on NBC when I was growing up. Churches of Christ gained national publicity for our near uniform views on the issue in two instances. First, in October of 1960, just weeks before the election, NBC crews arrived at the upscale and prestigious Hillsborough Church of Christ in Nashville to film for the broadcast on Chet Huntley's views a sermon by Batsell Barrett Baxter on the threat of Catholicism to American liberties. I don't know why this doesn't work. There we go. Baxter concluded the sermon with the warning, if the Roman Catholic Church should ever become large enough and strong enough to dominate the United States of America, the rest of the world would lose our religious freedom. He urged Christians to oppose the growth and spread of the Roman Catholic Church in every legitimate and honorable way. As Baxter brought his sermon to a close, there was a representative, Joe Irvins. Now, Joe served, I think I was reading, well, that's when he served, you know, long time, 17 or something elections. Al Gore's father held this seat before him, and Al Gore, who became vice president under Clinton, got the seat after he left. So just to give a little context of who he was. A member of the United States Congress and a member of the Hillsborough congregation stepped up from the audience and asked Baxter if he might speak for a few minutes. I came here to worship, Irvins objected, but I have heard a political speech. And he went on to call for tolerance of other religious persuasions. And so this created quite a ruckus at the time. Now it's interesting, and he was a Democrat, as were most in the South in that time. It's interesting though, and we see, okay, you know, fighting for and you know, I think probably taking the right position here. We would probably agree. Yet he also voted against all the Civil Rights Acts and all this and so on and so forth. So, meaning it's complicated. It's complicated. Yes,
Explain complications, because let's say, I'm just giving the benefit of the doubt,
sure.
that he voted against civil rights issues.
Uh-huh.
What else was in those bills
Yeah, well,
that he was
you mean,
blamed for voting against something?
well, you mean were those clean bills?
Yeah.
Meaning dealing with, we'd have to look at the history of that. I'm not sure.
You know, so
I'm not sure.
we really have to weigh these things.
Sure.
I just wrote in my notes here,
Yeah.
what would Jesus say with regard to Christendom in today's society?
Sure.
Wouldn't you love to be out there and have,
And you know what? That's what a lot of people wrestle with. You know, Ken.
It is, you know, I think we really lose sight of what it's all about
yeah,
when we start trying to make these kinds of determinations.
Sure.
What's right and what's wrong. I think the biggest danger to a group of Christians gathered like this is to get on a hobby horse about something like these kinds of issues, whether it's civil rights or Catholicism or
Sure.
women's rights or what we're gonna do about
But there are things that
sin
are,
is sin is sin is
that's
sin.
right. If
Yes.
it's a sin, we need to,
Stand against it.
yes,
Sure.
Be
Now-
vocal about standing against it. But
How-
don't try to make sin
Everybody.
out of everybody else's ideas.
Sure. Sure.
and it's difficult to weigh these kinds of
And
things.
that's what we mean by complicated.
It is, because
You know.
here's David. Let's go back a few years. David Flandre, David murder, David this, David this, David this.
Well, he and John Kennedy had a lot in common.
So, but yet when Saul had an attitude such that don't take my kingdom from me, versus David's, please don't take I have one was don't take the kingdom from me. David's part was don't take your spirit from me.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? I'm messed up. I'm struggling.
Mhm.
But I want to know you.
And
How
thus,
basic is that?
David, a man after God's own heart.
Exactly.
And so it was, yeah, because I mean, you're right. He was like, "Whoa, David, you're doing a lot of bad stuff."
A lot of this is way above shaped notes
Sure, sure.
and toilets in the house and the kitchens in the building and this and that and all this
Sure,
other nonsense.
sure.
But where is our focus?
Now, wait a minute, now you're gonna get way off track here. And that's the point. You can't come up with a subject that you're not going to have division within the body if you're gonna make an issue of it.
There you go.
Well, and that'll go to the question later. Is so how does one respond to that? Does one ignore it? Because that was done. Does one, in other words, it's complicated. And again, just trying to
Well,
show us how these things
There
are.
folks out there now riding buggies, but they have a heart for God.
Yeah.
Now, how can I judge a person like that?
Yeah.
I can say, we know the same God.
Yeah.
If we're looking and striving and trying to know Him.
But you know, and I don't know, I'm saying yes, I read fiction. But anyway, if the fiction is any way researched, each one of their churches has a bishop. And the bishop controls that church. So how is he different from the Pope?
Well, there you go.
Well, you're talking what's called polity. In other words, the organizational structure, polity, sorry, on how it's run. And that in our fellowship's history was a big deal. For others, you know, it wasn't, but that's another discussion.
But he brought it up.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So the Christian Chronicle reported that the reaction of the 1,152 member congregation, that's giant, certainly back then, was an overwhelming endorsement of the sermon that had been preached, and B.C. Goodpasture, an elder of the congregation, defended Baxter's exposure of Roman error and described Irvin's remarks as most ill-advised and unfortunate. And so again, we see this dynamic happening. In the second incident that gained national publicity, V.E. Howard, a radio evangelist, confronted Kennedy directly when the candidate appeared in a televised meeting with the Houston Ministerial Association on September 1960. After publicly reading selections from the Catholic Encyclopedia on the doctrine of mental reservation, Howard asked Kennedy if he accepted or rejected these authoritative Catholic declarations. Because remember, he's coming to it like if you're Catholic, you have to do everything that's said. And so, I have not read the Catholic Encyclopedia, Kennedy responded. I don't know all the quotations you're giving me. I don't agree with the statements. I find no difficulty in saying so. But I do think probably I could have made a better comment if I had the entire quotation before me. Howard reported in the Gospel Advocate that Kennedy had sought to evade the issue. And the Christian Chronicle proclaimed the Catholic doctrine of mental reservation was placed squarely in John Kennedy's path here on September 12th, and he dodged it. Now, this is what we see today. In other words, he's saying, you know what, I don't know what that's saying. Now, whether I'm assuming he's telling the truth. And so he says, I'm not going to answer that because I don't know specifically what you're talking about.
Can you define that? Mental reservation, what does that mean?
I don't know what all that is.
That means that I can tell a lie and tell you it's the truth. That's mental reservation.
Okay. And so, but the point is that to me, when they said, well, he evaded and wouldn't answer. Well, he said, I don't know what the particulars are you're talking about. And so I'm just saying, and we see this all the time, that is that being fair? I don't know.
We see a lot of mental reservation going on now, or have.
Very much so.
years.
No, well, no, I don't disagree
What
with
is
you.
this doctrine of mental reservation?
That's what he just said.
I
Well-
Tell a lie and say it's the truth.
oh my goodness, you got.
We'll have to look it up. Okay, and I'm assuming that's.
It's a little more complex.
Anyhow, the point is in these things, is that we can ascribe things to people that may or may, it's like, and again, I'm just bringing up examples that we heard. I'm not advocating one or another. The Project 2025 that they tried to label Trump with, which is a policy thing from the Heritage Institute, which is not, part of that. But anyhow, and so they kept trying to pin that, and then Trump would keep saying, I haven't even read the thing. Meaning a similar kind of tactic is all I'm saying. And so, given the benefit of the doubt, let's say he doesn't know. And so he's just saying, I can't answer that because I don't know what I'm answering to. And so anyhow, things get all carried away. With all this said and done, the campaign launched by the Churches of Christ against the election of John Kennedy revealed two new dimensions that have recently come to characterize our tradition. First, it revealed the considerable extent to which our Churches of Christ had abandoned the separatist, apolitical, apocalyptic outlook that had governed us since the 19th century. And second, it revealed the extent to which Churches of Christ now identified and even defended the conservative Protestant culture of the American South. The anti-Kennedy campaign revealed the fact that Churches of Christ had now become a denomination despite all of our protests. In other words, we were strongly embedded in the culture, and the thinking of the culture is the point that's being made. And with that, we will stop, and we will look at this very divisive topic that was the Vietnam War. No matter where somebody was, it was a hard topic. All right, thank you very much.